Thank you so much. Bom dia. It is truly a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Manfred, Mr. Dassenbrock, for that kind introduction to esteemed guests in the room. It is truly a pleasure to join you this morning. I was asked to share some global perspective from the World Council of Credit Unions. And so I wanted to share just a few slides on a global perspective of how credit unions are driving financial inclusion and getting at, hopefully, some of those very still important barriers that we must address in access to finance for underserved populations, including in Brazil and around the world. Thank you again for your time this morning. Just briefly, what I had organized here in some remarks was an agenda that focuses on a global perspective, some of my perspective coming into the World Council and understanding the global credit union movement, and a bit on the statistics from our latest global statistics report that touches on regions, some of the demographics, certainly in the Latin America region, and then a bit on challenges and opportunities and a look ahead. The global credit union movement is a sizable number of providers serving nearly 400 million individual members. We have over 87,000 institutions worldwide in over 100 countries. And while individually, our credit union systems have a relatively smaller market share in terms of asset size, collectively, we drive financial inclusion for the typically underserved segments of the population, which often include younger people, certainly women, certainly small businesses, the S of SME. And that is really what we at World Council try to focus on, very much tied to our social mission. And when I look at those numbers, I don't remember where I've come across this quote, but when we look at those numbers and this vast global footprint that we have as a collective group of financial providers, I truly believe that we must match our ambition to the scale of the challenges that we see today. When we look at the big picture, and these are data that's pulled by the World Bank, something called the Global Findex, which you were probably familiar with. It collects indicators across topics on account ownership and payments and savings and credit. It looks at underbanked and underserved individuals. We see that while we've made progress, there are still globally 1.4 billion people who are unbanked, who have no bank account, who often resort still to informal sources of access to credit, savings under the pillow, and that's really unacceptable. What we've seen over the last decade is quite a substantial increase in global account opening over the last 10 years from, just half of the adult population to 3/4 of the adult population now served. But when you dig a little bit deeper, it is actually mobile accounts, mobile phone accounts through some of the latest, mobile-driven, technology, financial services that has truly been the driver of that growth. Digital payments, we know, are an on-ramp, a way for lower income people to get access to forms of small credit and cash payments, cash transfers from governments. I emphasize this because in developing economies, we've seen a good traction of account opening through digital payments, use of digital payments. But in our statistical report, at least from the data in 2021 reported by our members, we see that only about half of all credit union systems around the world have access into national payment systems or are able to look at digital payments offerings, cards, and wallets to their customers. And so some of this is still a regulatory challenge that we at World Council are focusing on. Now, some of the other things relevant to us are how are we closing the gender gap? It hovered around 9 or 10%, points between access to services between men and women over the last couple of decades. We finally are seeing some closing of that gap, but it is persistent. And so how do we leverage our credit unions in a way that really understand segregating data by gender, and looking at how do we deepen our outreach and our non-financial support to women who have businesses, who often are income earners and are leaders of their household, which we know is single-handedly the way that we drive social development in countries at a national level. The last thing I wanted to point out in terms of global statistics is this challenge we have on how do we create not just access to credit and savings, but financial resilience of our customers at an individual level, at a household level, at a community level. And some of the more interesting data now being looked at is post-COVID, how are families doing when they suffer an incredibly difficult shock? That can be a pandemic shock. Today, we're looking at food insecurity, the costs of inflation. And what we see is that this ability to find funding in times of crisis is still very, very difficult for many families around the world. So for me, the business model of credit unions that really democratize the access and put ownership and service into communities and families that are, spread far and wide, especially in rural communities that are typically underserved. This question of how we design for resilience is going to be critical as we face the coming years. And so we at the World Council of Credit Unions are set up to champion and represent the business model of cooperative finance. And in my first year here, we have really tried to, as a team and with our board members and our kind of champions around the movement, think very carefully what ultimately is our purpose as a body advancing this global credit union movement. Our mission is to promote more equitable and resilient communities that can achieve financial inclusion powered by credit unions and cooperative financial institutions. And when I think about our value proposition, what do we do? What should we focus on? One of our most important roles as World Council is to advocate for credit unions in front of particularly the international standard setters. So advocacy with our regulatory bodies to advocate for fair playing fields, proportionality is one of the most important things that we do that ultimately is building the right ecosystem. The second purpose statement is that we are the international bridge between credit unions in certain countries and the international movement. And I like to say that in my first attendance of our worldwide conference that happens every July, I saw a sea of green shirts from many of our members in Brazil who attend in full force to represent the movement from Brazil, but also to share the kind of experience that we need to share and how are we serving the underserved and how are we advancing financial inclusion in the various markets where we have credit union systems. And so this investment in learning among professionals and particularly young people and women is a key role that we have, as is the need to reach underserved customers. And part of that is advancing and addressing still the barriers to gender equality and empowerment for those who are underrepresented in economies and in governments and in access to services that should be access for all. We want to be a catalyst for shared platforms and solutions that are happening everywhere, but often we see institutions innovating and then not taking advantage of solutions happening around the world. And how do we use technology to address thin file or unbanked customers? How do we ease the customer journey, reduce friction? This is what fintechs are very good at doing. And so how do we bring the best solutions through this vast network of credit unions who are serving members in places that are often very difficult to serve? And lastly, as a statement of the future, World Council is very much looking to position credit unions as a force for climate adaptation. How do we help lead our communities into a more sustainable and resilient future? Because this is ultimately the crisis of our time. We see connecting the dots of a war in Ukraine, food insecurity, access to resources, supply chains, all being exacerbated by very much a changing world that we live in, and extreme weather patterns that are happening right now across the northeast of the United States. I'm happy to be here in spite of the ice storm that blew in last night. So these three themes are really defining the way I see the future of how World Council represents and advocates for credit unions as an essential provider to drive financial inclusion globally. And how do we use digitalization? How do we think about services that reach customers in a way that advances sustainability? And how do we look at resilience at an individual level, but at community level in a way that informs the design of our products and services, that informs how our governance structures prioritize use of resources, and that we can use this to advocate with regulators on how to allow us to try to achieve what we are well positioned to achieve in democratizing financial access for lower income individuals. Just briefly, I wanted to give a bit of an overview of the regional credit union systems that make up the global movement. Some of you may be familiar with the world movement, but in terms of assets and the number of individual credit union financial institutions and the number of members, there's quite a sizable difference when we look by region, but certainly North America and Asia are leading in terms of assets. But we see in particular in Latin America a substantial number of members who are really those only served well by cooperative financial institutions. And to the right chart, you see kind of top 5 members who are the members that make up the World Council, who serve on the board and represent their countries, but also help us drive strategy and investments. Those are by far the US and the Canadian systems in terms of asset sizes, but you see that Australia, Korea, and Brazil are essentially kind of tied for being significant contributors and leaders in our movement. And we see that growth and opportunity in Brazil very clearly when we look at the innovations happening in your markets, and are very proud to have you not only as a member and represented on the board, but being part of the learning journeys across the international movement to show what innovation is taking place, how you are thinking about products and services, how you are engaging young people, women, rural areas, agricultural areas. Those are things that are ultimately the important role, I believe, that a credit union cooperative financial institution plays in a financial system. When we look at Latin America, Brazil by far stands out in terms of sizable country system, but we also have very large credit union and cooperative financial movements in Ecuador, certainly in Mexico. You can see the chart here in terms of asset sizes, but also the number of members that are served. We look at particular countries where we can bring capacity building as World Council, where we can look at seed funding or risk capital to try to help those systems not only grow and become more stable financially, but also be able to truly serve vulnerable populations in these different geographies. And I'll speak in a moment about some of the projects that we as an organization implement. So let me speak for a moment, not so much on challenges, but on the opportunities that the challenge presents. When I look at the purpose that we have at World Council and how do we help address some of the challenges, certainly advocacy for regulations that make it easy for credit unions to continue the work of serving the more vulnerable, one could say riskier populations. That is one of the things that we hear is still a priority risk that credit union professionals see, because often regulations are designed for big banks and they can be costly and difficult to implement for smaller banks and certainly credit union players unless there is some proportionality applied. I mentioned already digital innovation, climate, peer learning, because we are better together. These are all things that we see are pain points of members, and there is an opportunity for us to convene and create awareness of solutions that are happening in different parts of the world in a way that we can spread that knowledge and that collaboration across the network. Pioneers and social impact get at the heart of the mission we want to achieve, and ultimately surfacing examples in front of regulators and policymakers as well on how financial providers who are committed to both social and financial and environmental bottom lines can help add to policy agendas in creating better access for all citizens. And lastly, diverse voices is an important part of how do we build a future that includes the next generation of leaders. So these are both challenges for our credit union movement, but also opportunities for us to invest and collaborate together on how to solve them. So just a short focus on our advocacy agenda. Most of what we do is focus on the international standards that come out of the G20, that come out of the Basel Committee, that come out of the ISB. And we have certainly the EU that is at the forefront of some of the regulations around ESG or environmental, social, and governance requirements. And so much of what we do is look at how do we have standard setters acknowledge the need for financial inclusion and allow that to flow down to national agendas in a way that encourages credit unions to serve their members better rather than inhibit that service because of costly or burdensome regulations that are quite difficult to meet for smaller players. And so today we see regulations coming on ESG, instant payments, digital payments certainly is still a pain point. A lot of our focus is how do we look at making sure that proportionality and a good ecosystem for credit unions flows from the international bodies down to national regulators in a way that allows us to continue to expand our services. The Digital Growth Award that we started a few years ago, I wanted to mention specifically because our winner last year was a product design from Sicredi in particular. And we were very proud to honor one of the examples and pioneers in a technology-driven solution that gets at really opening access to underserved populations, in this case, the agricultural segment of customers through the product CPR Fácil. This issue of climate resilience and sustainability is something going into the future that we hope to collaborate much more closely with our colleagues in Brazil, but also in other pioneers we see advancing sustainable solutions, as well as a way to finance transition down to the retail level, as we all look and grapple with how do we become part of a solution of climate adaptation and transition to more green economies. What we've just begun this year is a bit of a surfacing of actors in our network who have very interesting models of their own design addressing the impacts of climate change on their members. And so from Canada, Van City and Vancouver, to Inclusive, another network in the US that has been pioneering solar financing across the American markets, certainly solar lending products out of Sicredi, reforestation that we see taking place in Colombia and Kenya, all across to a green handbook in Asia. We're surfacing some of these in an effort to really showcase how credit unions individually are coming up with innovative ways to address these challenges for their customers and hopefully lead to a body of evidence that we can share more globally as we try to advance sustainable financing in today's world. Many of the projects that we run out of World Council, with some US government funding support, other donations that we receive to try to provide seed capital and capacity building, hit at topics that get at this issue of creating better access and frameworks that will open up a service to underserved populations. And so we very much have projects in Latin America around the missing middle of small businesses that often do not get good access to business lending. We look at different ways of digital transformation that get at opening access, easing underwriting pain points, strategic partnerships with other global platforms such as MasterCard, Microsoft, some of the big names that you are familiar with. These are things that we are trying to bridge. How do we link into other global platforms and bring the best of technology, of service, of innovation, of access to the populations that we serve around the world? Certainly, women in finance is a big theme of ours that flows into projects such as in Senegal last year, where we created a gender investing framework to try to create better access for women business owners. We are hoping to do that across Africa and the Caribbean into next year. And then other second tier initiatives that include our Ukraine program, where we're looking at how do we create better liquidity and access to credit unions that have inadequate capital to be able to serve their members, or regulatory barriers that prevent them from issuing certain products. So those are just a sample of some of the development projects that we implement, always in partnership with a credit union or a set of actors that enhance our ability to understand and learn how can cooperative finance really drive financial inclusion. The last thing I want to mention, and Mr. Dassenbrock mentioned this earlier, one of the most meaningful projects that we have continued to implement is working with about 20 credit unions in Ukraine, who are some of the only actors in the country who continue lending to small businesses, particularly farmers. And we have continued that work in looking at a liquidity fund that advances loans to those farming areas still in Ukraine, and a philanthropic fund that we raised just in a matter of months to address displacement and to look at the rebuilding and the survival of the cooperative finance system in Ukraine. So the outpouring of support that we saw across the credit union movement in support of credit union was really a testament to the kind of collaboration that we have in a number of like-minded and socially committed providers that truly believe in cooperative finance and serving our members. So in conclusion, one of the things that I care about and is part of the reason I'm here is how do we think about the future and how do we continue to evolve our leadership, our governance in a way that raises voices of different generations, of women and men who believe in the business case of diverse decision-making and the richness that we get in collaborating across different cultures and across different ways of thinking. And so our Young Professionals Program, WOCCU, and our Global Women's Leadership Network are two bodies internationally that I know appear in different forms in Brazil among our credit union members, and that they are very much a part of helping us lead this new way of including a more diverse set of opinions in our credit union thought leadership. And so the last quote, you can see I like quotes, is from the former First Lady of South Africa, Dame Graça Machel, who speaks about it's not only good enough to say we need to have women, young people with a seat at the table. We really must redesign the table that we all sit around to accommodate new leadership, new thinking, diverse sets of members and geographies. I really believe we are in a new era where we have to think differently and we have to embrace the diversity that this amazing network of credit union leaders represent. So you are part of the movement in Brazil, whether you are a regulator, whether you are one of our credit union members and professionals, we really are as good as the leadership that we represent and the pioneers across the credit union movement that are part of the World Council of Credit Unions. So you lead the movement with us. And I'm very thankful for our professionals that I have met, many of you in Brazil. And I look forward very much to hopefully seeing some of you, if it's possible, at our board meeting and at the summit that will be taking place in April next year. So I hope to see you in person in Porto Alegre or in Foz do Iguaçu. It's been really a pleasure this morning. Thank you very much for your time and attention. And I'm quite pleased to be here and happy to take questions. Thank you very much.